The Galactic Council Chamber had been built to humble those who entered it, a vast ring of stone and metal suspended above a hollow sphere of starlight, where the delegates of 1,000 worlds sat in rising tiers that curved away into the glow, each species in its own section shaped to its biology, and at the very bottom, almost lost in the immensity of it all, sat the small blue and white emblem of Earth, accompanied by a handful of human representatives who had been granted observer status rather than full membership, a courtesy extended to them more out of curiosity than respect. And as the session opened with the low harmonic tones that served as the council's call to order, the mood toward humanity was one of thinly veiled amusement. For in the centuries since humans had first reached beyond their own system and made contact, they have been cataloged as energetic, creative, and stubborn, but technologically unremarkable and strategically naive compared to the ancient powers that ruled the spiral arms, and the Council's senior species, those who had waged wars before Earth had even formed, had long since decided that the newcomers from a single yellow star would remain a minor footnote in galactic history, useful perhaps as labor, trade partners, or buffer states, but never as equals, and certainly never as a military factor worth serious consideration, which was why when the Zerati Imperium's envoy rose and, with theatrical politeness, announced that several human frontier systems would be annexed for reasons of security and resource optimization, a ripple of soft laughter passed through the chamber, and why when the human ambassador protested, speaking of sovereignty and treaties, the laughter grew louder, tinged with the indulgent tone one might use with a child who did not yet understand how the world truly worked, and why when the envoy added that the Imperium would be generous in its terms, offering relocation and limited autonomy, the mood became one of settled inevitability, as if the matter were already decided, and in that moment, on the far edge of human space, aboard a long, angular warship that bore the simple name Resolute, Admiral Daniel Carter stood on the command deck and listened to the same words relayed through tight beam communication, his face calm, his posture relaxed, and his eyes fixed on the star map that filled the forward wall, showing a web of systems, lanes, and fleets, including the massive formations of the Imperium moving with stately confidence toward the outer colonies, and around him his officers waited, some tense, some angry, some quietly focused, all of them aware that this was a moment the galaxy had assumed would end in human retreat and concession, and all of them knowing that Carter had been chosen for this command not because he was the loudest or the most aggressive, but because in decades of service he had shown a particular talent for seeing beyond what an opponent wanted him to see, for understanding not just the movement of ships, but the habits of minds. And as the Council's decision was finalized and the Imperium's claim was formally recorded, Carter gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and said that it was time to begin Phase 1. And with that quiet order, a chain of events was set in motion that would, in the years to come, be studied in every naval academy from the core to the rim as the turning point when the long-standing hierarchy of the galaxy began to fracture. For while the council chamber still echoed with polite dismissals and confident predictions, human couriers were already racing along hidden routes, carrying encrypted packets to fleets that had been quietly assembled and drilled far from prying sensors. Fleets built not to impress with size or ornament, but to fight with speed, coordination, and a doctrine that treated space not as a flat plane of movement, but as a three-dimensional ocean of currents and pressure. And as the Imperium's armadas advanced in their traditional layer formations, confident that their mass firepower and ancient battle protocols would overwhelm any resistance, Carter's forces began to move in patterns that would have seemed chaotic to an outside observer, spreading, converging, vanishing into regions of dense stellar clutter, and reappearing along vectors that no standard predictive model would have prioritized, all while the human colonies prepared for evacuation and defense in ways that, to the Imperium's intelligence analysts, looked like the frantic, uncoordinated measures of a species that knew it was about to lose. And so the analysts reported what their superiors expected to hear. The admirals of the Imperium reaffirmed their confidence, and the Council, informed in briefings and side conversations, continued to regard the coming conflict as a small and unfortunate, but ultimately trivial correction to the political map, unaware that the quiet man on the bridge of the Resolute had spent years studying the Imperium's logistics, its command culture, its reliance on rigid hierarchies and pre-planned responses, and that he'd built his strategy around the simple assumption that an opponent who had never been seriously challenged would be slow to recognize when the nature of war had changed. And as the first skirmishes broke out along the frontier, with human patrols retreating in apparent disorder and Imperium vanguards pressing forward, the pattern of events seemed to confirm every prejudice held by the Thousand Worlds, even as, behind the scenes, Carter and his staff tracked fuel consumption, communication delays, and the subtle shifts in deployment that revealed where the Imperium's true centers of gravity lay. And when the time came, he began to apply pressure not with a single dramatic blow, but with a series of carefully timed strikes that disrupted supply nodes, isolated task forces, and forced local commanders to request guidance from a command structure that was already strained by the sheer scale of its own advance. And each request, each delay, each minor loss was small enough to be dismissed on its own, but together they formed a pattern of friction that slowed the Imperium's momentum and bought the humans time. Time to bring forward heavier units, to rotate crews, to test new tactics under combat conditions, and to let their opponents grow accustomed to the idea that the war would be a steady, grinding push rather than a sudden reversal. And all the while the Council continued its sessions, debating trade quotas, border disputes, and cultural exchanges, with the human seat increasingly empty as their diplomats were recalled and their communications became more guarded, a withdrawal that many interpreted as a sign of resignation. And in private gatherings, the representatives of the older powers spoke of how unfortunate it was that Earth had overreached, how the Imperium's annexation would at least bring stability to that region, and how the lesson would serve as a reminder to other young species of their place in the galactic order, not knowing that the lesson, when it came, would be far more profound and far more unsettling than any of them expected. The first disruptions, seemingly minor and random, began to accumulate across the frontier systems, where the Imperium had assumed an easy occupation would take mere months, and at first their commanders were annoyed rather than alarmed, interpreting the sudden loss of a convoy here or the disappearance of a scouting frigate there as glitches, accidents, or perhaps minor rebellions that would be crushed with routine measures. But as the days passed, patterns emerged that defied all conventional reasoning, for the human forces, small, agile, and seemingly uncoordinated, were operating according to principles that the Imperium had long dismissed as primitive, exploiting terrain in space such as asteroid belts, nebulae, and gravitational wells not as hazards, but as tools to conceal movement, to delay detection, and to manipulate the enemy's expectations. And every action was part of a larger rhythm designed by Carter, whose calculations incorporated not just the physics of space and the capabilities of his own fleet, but the psychology of his opponents, anticipating how each commander would react to provocation, delay, or feint. And when Imperium sensors reported the sudden appearance of human task forces in sectors where no fleet should logically exist, their officers at first argued over the accuracy of the data, believing the anomaly a technical failure, a ghost, or perhaps a miscommunication from a junior officer. But by the end of the first standard rotation cycle, it became evident that human units were striking at key infrastructure points with precise timing and then vanishing before reinforcements could arrive, cutting supply lines, disrupting communications, and forcing local garrisons to divert forces, which in turn slowed the main advance and caused cascading effects across multiple sectors. And each small victory, each tactical maneuver that had seemed insignificant when viewed in isolation, added up to a growing sense of unease among the Imperium's commanders, who had expected to march into the frontier with impunity. And meanwhile, back on the human side, colonies that had been preparing for evacuation quietly reinforced landing points, installed decoy systems, and readied defensive grids that would trigger automated responses, all orchestrated to maximize friction and exploit the Imperium's rigid chain of command. And as Carter observed these developments from the Resolute, he issued orders that balanced aggression with restraint, knowing that the true measure of success would be the slow erosion of the enemy's confidence, not just their material losses. And in the council chambers, when reports reached the delegates of 1,000 worlds, the tone shifted subtly from amusement to concern, for the pattern of anomalies was now unmistakable. And even the most senior members of the council began to question whether they had underestimated humanity, a species they had long catalogued and dismissed, and in private, Corridors of power. Whispers began to circulate about the unexpected resilience and ingenuity of the humans, about the way a single admiral had anticipated the movements of entire fleets and turned every apparent weakness into a strategic advantage. And as weeks turned into months, the human forces escalated their operations in a manner that appeared sporadic but was, in reality, part of grand design, employing small skirmishes to mask the buildup of larger task forces, drawing the Imperium's units into carefully prepared traps, forcing them to overextend supply lines, and subtly shifting the battlefield into areas where human knowledge and adaptability gave them the edge, and each engagement, each feint and ambush, reinforced the growing legend among human crews that their actions were part of something much larger, a campaign that was as much about psychology as it was about firepower. And as the Imperium's fleets began to experience frustration, confusion, and the first significant losses, the Council convened emergency sessions to reassess the situation, and reports flowed back to the Assembly showing that human strategy, while unconventional, was not merely reactive but proactive, anticipating moves that should have been impossible to predict. And the delegates, who had long believed humans incapable of strategic thought on a galactic scale, now faced evidence that an entirely new type of warfare had emerged, led by an admiral whose vision was as precise as it was audacious. And on Earth, amid celebrations and quiet preparations alike, Carter continued to direct the orchestration of fleets, supply lines, and colonies with meticulous care, knowing that the Imperium's overconfidence had become a weapon in itself, for every misjudgment by their commanders amplified the effectiveness of human tactics. And as he monitored the growing tension and hesitation among enemy officers, he prepared for the next phase, which would involve coordinated strikes on major strongholds, where the human ability to combine technology, deception, and psychology would create the first true shockwaves of the campaign. And throughout the galaxy, whispers of an unexpected human resurgence began to circulate, first among scouts and minor commanders, then reaching high councils and ruling bodies. And while the Imperium struggled to maintain order, the humans, under Carter's guidance, continued to act with a patience and precision that confounded expectations. And as the first major engagement of the offensive unfolded, where human forces struck simultaneously at multiple points, the Imperium's armadas, previously confident and coordinated, found themselves reacting rather than leading, their movements dictated by the humans' initiative, and each victory, each carefully calculated disruption, chipped away at the veneer of inevitability the Imperium had assumed, proving that one admiral, one determined species, and one meticulous strategy could indeed challenge the dominance of 1,000 worlds. And as the ripple effects of these operations spread, the Council and all observers began to understand, too late, that the humans were not merely defending themselves. They were rewriting the rules of engagement, demonstrating capacity for innovation, adaptability, and coordination that had been underestimated at every step. And in the quiet of his command center, Carter allowed himself a brief moment to consider the scale of what was unfolding, knowing that this was a moment when history would mark a turning point, and that when the dust settled, the galaxy would have to acknowledge that humanity, long mocked and dismissed, had changed the trajectory of its future forever. The Imperium's initial disbelief soon evolved into mounting panic as human operations became increasingly audacious and widespread, striking deep into territory that had been considered secure and untouchable, where orbital shipyards, energy refineries, and communication hubs were systematically disrupted, not with the goal of immediate destruction, but with precise, targeted actions designed to force commanders into reactive cycles that sapped morale and slowed the advance of entire fleets. And each isolated success was amplified by carefully coordinated misinformation campaigns, decoys, and electronic countermeasures that masked the true size and intent of human forces, so that the Imperium, accustomed to overwhelming mass and predictable responses, found itself facing a ghostly enemy whose movements defied conventional logic. And in this shadow war, the humans, under Admiral Carter's guidance, exploited every advantage offered by the three-dimensional battlefield of space, using asteroid clusters, dense nebulae, and microgravitational anomalies as concealment and leverage, turning areas once considered navigational hazards into lethal traps, while simultaneously mobilizing human colonies to provide logistical support and rapid reinforcement, creating a web of interconnected operations that the Imperium could neither anticipate nor easily counter. And the psychological impact of these maneuvers was immense, For the aliens had long prided themselves on their calculated, disciplined approach to war, believing that numbers, technology, and ancient doctrine were sufficient to subdue any challenge. Yet the humans demonstrated a unique combination of creativity, resilience, and adaptability that forced even the most senior admirals to reconsider their assumptions, while on Earth, the civilian population, once dismissed as insignificant by the Council, was mobilized in a comprehensive, coordinated effort, contributing to intelligence gathering, production of advanced materials, and strategic planning, creating an integrated society-wide effort that blurred the line between military and civilian, and the Imperium, unable to comprehend the depth and efficiency of human organization, began suffering repeated tactical setbacks that eroded both confidence and cohesion, and as the first of the major battles erupted, where human forces engaged seemingly superior enemy armadas, the combination of ambushes, misdirection, and precision strikes shattered the expectations of the Imperium, whose commanders had anticipated conventional engagements, only to find themselves caught in overlapping fields of fire, cut off from reinforcements, and forced into defensive maneuvers that left them vulnerable on multiple fronts. And each setback reinforced the emerging legend among human crews that their efforts were part of a grand design, a campaign orchestrated with foresight and patience, turning every apparent disadvantage into an opportunity to escalate the pressure on the enemy. And as these engagements continued, reports began leaking to the Council chambers that humans were not merely surviving. They were redefining the very concept of tactical supremacy, leveraging speed, intelligence, and adaptability to impose chaos on a force that had assumed its own superiority. And as weeks of conflict unfolded, Carter expanded the scope of operations, using feints, diversions, and selective strikes to lure the Imperium's fleets into regions where human forces had prepositioned resources and hidden reserves, creating situations where the aliens, once confident in their technological dominance, found themselves trapped in unfavorable positions with dwindling supplies, disrupted communications, and rapidly eroding morale. And even as the Imperium attempted to regroup and reassert control, human ingenuity and foresight ensured that each countermeasure was anticipated, neutralized, or redirected with operational tempo, coordination, and precision that made it appear as if the humans were always one step ahead. And in council discussions, the whispers of doubt grew louder as members debated the unexpected effectiveness of a species they had long dismissed, realizing that the admiral who led these efforts was not merely a competent officer, but a visionary strategist whose understanding of warfare extended beyond technology into the realms of psychology, timing, and deception. And the longer the campaign continued, the more the Imperium's confidence eroded, replaced by uncertainty and fear, and as human operations extended into multiple sectors simultaneously, exploiting every weakness, the effect was cumulative, with logistical networks collapsing under strain, command hierarchies becoming overstretched and conflicted, and alien officers forced to make snap judgments under pressure, all while Carter maintained the overall strategic picture, directing actions on the resolute with meticulous care, anticipating the enemy's reactions, exploiting overconfidence, and orchestrating events so that even setbacks were incorporated into the larger plan, reinforcing deception and manipulating expectations. And as the conflict escalated, the humans revealed the first signs of advanced, adaptive technologies that had been quietly tested and deployed, such as autonomous drones capable of operating independently in complex environments, energy weapons optimized for precision strikes, and communication systems that could bypass conventional detection methods, creating an operational advantage that combined innovation with discipline, while simultaneously reinforcing perception among the Imperium that humans were unpredictable and dangerous in ways that transcended mere numbers or firepower. And as the first major strongholds were engaged, where human forces executed coordinated attacks across multiple vectors, the Imperium's armadas, accustomed to overwhelming and decisive engagement, found themselves reacting defensively, unable to assert initiative, while the Council and the Galactic audience, previously confident in the inevitability of the human subjugation, were forced to confront the reality that one admiral, operating with skill, foresight, and unyielding determination, had altered the balance of power, turning a dismissed species into a strategic threat that no one could ignore. And across the galaxy, the narrative began to shift from derision to respect, from dismissal to cautious acknowledgement, as humanity demonstrated not just the capacity for survival, but the ability to dictate the terms of engagement, reshape expectations, and ultimately change the course of history in ways that no one, not even the oldest and most experienced species, had anticipated. The Imperium's command structure, long celebrated for its rigidity, experience, and control over vast fleets, began to fracture under the relentless, unpredictable human assaults, as the effects of Admiral Carter's strategy compounded across space, creating simultaneous crises that no single commander could resolve, and every attempt at countermeasure seemed anticipated, with humans exploiting gravitational anomalies, communication delays, and logistical choke points to manipulate the pace and direction of engagements, turning predictable doctrines into liabilities. And the alien admirals, who had spent centuries mastering linear strategies and overwhelming firepower, found themselves ensnared in a multidimensional chess game where conventional tactics were not merely ineffective, but actively dangerous. And as the front lines stretched, the Imperium supply chains faltered, communication grids became unreliable, and units that were intended to reinforce each other instead collided, or were isolated in ways that rendered their numerical superiority meaningless. While Carter, observing from the Resolute, orchestrated every movement with patience and precision, using human adaptability to convert apparent disadvantages into tactical leverage. And with each engagement, the humans' reputation among the Imperium's forces grew, not as a mere nuisance, but as a calculated, intelligent, and relentless opponent whose ability to coordinate strikes, feints, and retreats created a psychological strain far exceeding the physical losses. And in the council chambers, where delegates had once laughed at the human seat, the mood shifted to a mixture of concern, disbelief, and fear, for reports that humans had infiltrated secure sectors, disabled orbital shipyards, and intercepted communications without detection painted a picture of an adversary that no existing doctrine could contain. And as the Imperium scrambled to adapt, Carter expanded operations to include simultaneous assaults on multiple sectors, exploiting not only strategic vulnerabilities, but also the complacency and overconfidence of enemy commanders who believed that their numbers and experience would inevitably prevail, and with every strike, whether a sabotage mission that crippled energy networks, a coordinated ambush that destroyed patrol fleets, or a diversion that drew enemy forces into traps, the human forces demonstrated a mastery of timing, coordination, and tactical foresight that defied the expectations of civilization accustomed to predictable outcomes. While on the home front, Earth's industries, research facilities, and colonies operated as an integrated network, producing advanced weaponry, intelligence tools, and logistic solutions that kept pace with the front lines, allowing humans to sustain operations that the Imperium could neither anticipate nor fully comprehend. And as months passed, the psychological impact on alien officers deepened, with uncertainty replacing confidence, hesitation replacing initiative, and fear quietly spreading through ranks that had never before known defeat at the hands of species so recently admitted to galactic affairs. And when Carter began implementing the next phase of his campaign, which involved coordinated multi-sector strikes designed to collapse the Imperium's command and control structure entirely, even the most senior generals were forced into reactive postures, unable to anticipate movements that combined speed, deception, and adaptability in ways that no static doctrine could count for. And as human forces pressed their advantage, eliminating key nodes of command, disrupting supply and reinforcement routes, and forcing alien units into defensive circles, the Imperium realized too late that the conflict had entered an entirely new stage, where conventional numerical superiority and established tactics were no longer sufficient to secure victory. And in secret briefings, alien political leaders began to whisper about the possibility of total strategic collapse, while back on Earth, the human population, informed by a combination of open communication and selective intelligence leaks, continue to support and reinforce the war effort with ingenuity, resilience, and coordination, creating a society in which every citizen, from technicians to strategists to field operatives, contributed to a broader campaign that leveraged human adaptability, creativity, and collective will. And as the Imperium struggled to regain cohesion, Carter's meticulous orchestration ensured that every setback, every perceived delay, and every minor loss was absorbed into a larger strategy that maintained the momentum of the offensive, while the council and galaxy at large watched in mounting astonishment as humans, once dismissed as primitive and insignificant, proved capable of reshaping the operational environment, controlling the tempo of conflict, and dictating outcomes that no combination of alien experience or technology had prepared them for. And with each passing cycle, the humans' ability to combine technological innovation, tactical brilliance, psychological insight, and societal cohesion transformed them from an underestimated species into a galactic force capable of challenging and defeating an empire that had once assumed its dominance unassailable, marking the beginning of a campaign that would be remembered for centuries as the moment when humanity, through determination, intellect, and courage, rewrote the rules of war and demonstrated that a single admiral, guided by foresight and audacity, could alter the fate of 1,000 worlds and change the trajectory of the galaxy itself, leaving a legacy that would endure long after the last ships had returned and the full scope of their achievements had been measured. As the Imperium grappled with the escalating human offensive, the full genius of Admiral Carter's campaign began to reveal itself in ways that went far beyond tactical engagements. For every maneuver, every feint, every calculated withdrawal was part of a larger orchestration designed not merely to inflict damage, but to dismantle the enemy's assumptions, expose the rigidity of their command structure, and instill doubt and fear at every level of decision-making in the aliens who had long prided themselves on centuries of disciplined military tradition, were increasingly unable to reconcile the relentless precision, creativity, and adaptability of human operations with their expectations of a species that had been cataloged as energetic but fundamentally inexperienced. And Carter, observing from the Resolute, expanded the theater of operations, introducing simultaneous strikes across multiple sectors that exploited weaknesses in the Imperium's deployment patterns, overextended supply lines, and created dilemmas where enemy commanders were forced to choose between conflicting priorities, each decision designed to amplify friction, slow response times, and generate cascading operational failures. And the humans, trained to operate within a flexible command philosophy that allowed initiative at all levels, executed each phase with remarkable efficiency, leveraging orbital debris fields, nebular clouds, and gravitational anomalies to conceal movements, confuse sensors, and force the Imperium into reactive cycles. And as these operations unfolded, alien officers began to report anomalies with growing concern, patterns that suggested coordination beyond what they thought possible for human forces. And while they debated whether these were clever improvisations or evidence of unknown technological advancements, the humans simultaneously engaged in cyber and electronic warfare that disrupted communications, intercepted command protocols, and neutralized automated defense grids, creating strategic openings without committing overwhelming force. And across the human control systems, the population supported the campaign with a unity and purpose that the Imperium had never encountered, supplying intelligence, resources, and logistical support in a decentralized but highly coordinated manner, enabling Carter to sustain momentum and maintain operational tempo far beyond what enemy intelligence could predict. And as weeks turned into months, the Imperium's fleets, once confident and cohesive, began to experience severe strain as operational delays, isolated losses, and repeated disruptions sapped morale, eroded confidence in leadership, and forced commanders into conservative strategies that only magnified the humans' advantage. And when the first major stronghold fell to human forces, an orbital shipyard that had been considered impregnable, the shock reverberated through both the Imperium and the Council, demonstrating that humans were capable, not just of surviving, but of seizing initiative, dictating the terms of engagement, and achieving decisive results in situations previously considered hopeless. And the psychological impact was profound, as alien officers realized that their doctrines, honed over millennia, were being systematically undermined by a species they had underestimated at every level. And as Carter prepared the next series of operations, he leveraged this emerging awareness, designing actions that would exploit fear and hesitation, creating situations where overconfidence, misjudgment, and reactionary decision-making compounded the effectiveness of his plans. And in the council chambers, delegates began to acknowledge privately that humanity had transformed from an underestimated observer into a formidable force whose strategic brilliance, technological ingenuity, and societal cohesion had fundamentally altered the balance of power, and as the humans pressed forward, expanding their control over Contested sectors, establishing secure supply lines, and executing multi-pronged operations that combine deception, precision strikes, and psychological manipulation, the Imperium's response became increasingly fragmented, with regional commanders acting independently, often in conflict with one another, and with every misstep magnifying humans' advantage, while Carter, maintaining an unbroken strategic overview, coordinated the offensive with patience and foresight, ensuring that every action contributed to the larger objective of destabilizing the Imperium, weakening its command structures, and ultimately demonstrating the vast potential of human innovation and determination. And across the galaxy, stories of human ingenuity, bravery, and tactical brilliance began to circulate, shifting perceptions from derision and dismissal to wary respect. As species who had once regarded humans as minor players realized that the future of interstellar affairs could no longer be assumed or controlled by traditional hierarchies, and as the campaign reached critical mass, with human forces poised to strike simultaneously across key sectors, the Imperium faced an unprecedented crisis of command, cohesion, and morale in the Council, forced to acknowledge the scale and effectiveness of the human campaign, began to understand that one admiral, commanding a determined, resourceful, and adaptive species, had altered the trajectory of history, reshaping the galaxy's balance of power, and proving that the underestimated, when guided by vision, discipline, and courage, could redefine the very rules by which civilizations measured strength, strategy, and survival. The human offensive, now in full swing, began to systematically dismantle the Imperium's ability to project power across its frontier, and every move was carefully calibrated by Admiral Carter to exploit both material and psychological weaknesses in the alien command structure. For while the Imperium had long relied on rigid hierarchies, overwhelming firepower, and predictable doctrines to maintain control, the humans leveraged flexibility, deception, and decentralized initiative to impose chaos, creating opportunities where none should have existed. And as human fleets slipped through seemingly impossible gaps, struck at critical supply nodes, and vanished into regions previously considered impassable, alien commanders faced repeated dilemmas in which any decision carried risk, delay, or loss. And with each successive engagement, the effectiveness of conventional tactics eroded further, exposing the vulnerabilities that centuries of tradition had masked. And on the home front, Earth's population coordinated an unprecedented war effort, with colonies providing intelligence, resources, and forward operating support, ensuring that every human maneuver was reinforced, sustained, and multiplied by a network of civic and military collaboration that the Imperium had failed to anticipate. And as the Imperium scrambled to respond, deploying larger fleets, reallocating forces, and issuing orders to recapture lost territory, they found themselves increasingly reactive, forced into positions that had been carefully designed by Carter to exploit their rigid thinking, overextended lines, and reliance on predictable reinforcement schedules. And when the first major urban centers and occupied sectors were targeted by human operations, using precision orbital strikes, electronic interference, and rapid insertion of special teams, the Imperium realized that the conflict was no longer localized or manageable, but coordinated, multidimensional campaign that leveraged speed, deception, and superior situational awareness to outmaneuver forces several times their size. And as alien morale faltered under the cumulative impact of unexpected setbacks, constant operational stress, and the perception of an omnipresent, adaptive opponent, the council chambers, once confident in the inevitability of human submission, became filled with tension and unease as delegates struggled to reconcile the evidence of human capability with centuries of assumptions and intelligence. Reports, often dismissed in the past, now prompted emergency consultations, as the Imperium attempted to comprehend the scale and sophistication of human strategy, unaware that every misjudgment, every moment of hesitation, played directly into Carter's overarching plan, which combined tactical brilliance with psychological insight, ensuring that alien commanders were compelled to make choices that favored human objectives. And in these months of relentless operations, the humans demonstrated mastery of both technology and strategy, deploying autonomous drones capable of independent action, electronic countermeasures that neutralize conventional detection methods, and specialized strike teams that executed high-risk, high-reward missions with precision, all while maintaining supply lines, reinforcements, and civilian support across a sprawling theater of operations. And as key sectors fell under coordinated human control, the Imperium's response became increasingly desperate, with units acting in isolation, orders delayed or miscommunicated, and commanders forced into reactionary measures that further amplified the effectiveness of human tactics. And every calculated maneuver reinforced the psychological impact on alien forces, who began to perceive humanity not as a minor nuisance, but as an adaptive, intelligent, and relentless adversary capable of dictating the terms of engagement. And as Carter prepared the next stage of operations, involving multi-sector strikes, designed to fracture enemy cohesion completely, the Imperium's officers found themselves trapped in a strategic environment they could neither control nor predict, while Earth and its colonies continued to operate as a unified, resilient network, demonstrating the power of coordination, ingenuity, and shared purpose. And as human fleets struck simultaneously, overwhelming isolated strongholds, disrupting command nodes, and exploiting environmental advantages, the Imperium's numerical and technological superiority proved insufficient against the integrated strategy, psychological manipulation, and operational foresight of the species that had been underestimated at every level. And in the council, whispers of awe, fear, and disbelief spread among delegates who realized that humans, once dismissed as insignificant observers, were now actively rewriting the rules of warfare, establishing themselves as a strategic force capable of challenging empires. And as the galaxy watched, the legend of Admiral Carter and the human fleets began to take hold, a story of precision, patience, and audacity that would be remembered as the moment when the underestimated became the dominant, when a single visionary commander and a determined species changed the course of history. And in every engagement, every calculated strike, and every seemingly improbable maneuver, humanity proved that adaptability, intelligence, and unity could overcome expectation, complacency, and even overwhelming power, leaving the Imperium scrambling to salvage what remained of its prestige, authority, and influence, while across the stars, a new era dawned in which humans were no longer dismissed, no longer underestimated, and no longer confined to a role that 1,000 worlds had once assumed was theirs by default. With the Imperium reeling from a series of coordinated multi-sector human operations, Admiral Carter pressed forward, turning what had begun as a defensive struggle into a full-scale, meticulously orchestrated campaign of strategic dominance. And every maneuver, every feint, and every strike was carefully synchronized to maximize pressure, disrupt command hierarchies, and exploit the weaknesses of an enemy that had grown complacent over centuries of unchallenged authority. And the humans, operating from a combination of stealth, intelligence superiority, and adaptive tactics, leveraged natural hazards such as asteroid fields, dense nebulae, and gravitational anomalies to mask fleet movements, manipulate enemy expectations, and create opportunities for decisive engagement, while maintaining operational tempo that the Imperium could neither anticipate nor counter. And as the first wave of coordinated strikes targeted critical infrastructure across multiple sectors, alien commanders were forced into reactive cycles that compounded stress, sapped morale, and left units isolated and vulnerable. And even as they attempted to regroup, human forces, guided by Carter's vision, executed secondary operations designed to anticipate and counter these responses, creating a cascading effect of disruption, confusion, and forced errors. And on Earth, the civilian population and colony networks operated as a unified system of support, logistics, and intelligence, ensuring that human operations could continue with sustained momentum, precise timing, and an unbroken chain of reinforcement that the Imperium had no framework to counter. And as the Imperium's armadas engaged human task forces, they found themselves facing a combination of technological innovation, psychological manipulation, and unconventional strategy, with autonomous drones conducting independent operations, electronic warfare disrupting communications, and specialized strike teams executing missions that neutralize key assets with surgical precision, all orchestrated to maintain initiative and force alien commanders into positions of disadvantage. And as months of continuous operations unfolded, the cumulative effect on alien morale, command cohesion, and operational effectiveness became undeniable, with previously confident officers expressing uncertainty, hesitation, and fear in the face of a human adversary whose vision, coordination, and adaptability defied every expectation. And as Carter expanded operations into new sectors, targeting core supply lines, orbital shipyards, and forward command nodes, the Imperium found itself unable to regain control, with fragmented units, miscommunications, and overextended lines magnifying humans' advantage at every turn, and the Council, observing reports and intelligence, shifted from derision to astonishment, acknowledging privately that the humans had transformed from a minor observer into a strategic force capable of dictating terms, redefining engagement, and challenging centuries of assumed dominance. And the psychological effect on alien populations and officers alike was profound, as the perception of humans evolved from unpredictable nuisances to calculated, relentless adversaries whose patience, cunning, and foresight rendered the Imperium's traditional superiority increasingly irrelevant. And as human operations pressed forward, combining feints, ambushes, and precise strikes, the Imperium's strategic posture deteriorated, and what had been a confident hierarchical command structure now struggled under the weight of uncertainty, dispersed forces, and operational misjudgments, while Carter, observing the effects in real time, adjusted plans, exploited weaknesses, and ensured that every success reinforced both the physical and psychological pressure on the enemy. And with each engagement, humanity demonstrated the power of adaptability, cohesion, and intelligence, transforming apparent disadvantages into decisive advantages. And by the time the first major alien strongholds fell, not through overwhelming firepower, but through careful orchestration, deception, and relentless operational tempo, the galaxy was witnessing a historic shift, as a single admiral in a species long dismissed had rewritten the rules of warfare, proving the effectiveness of strategy over sheer numbers, and established humanity as a force whose ingenuity, determination, and audacity could challenge and overcome even the most formidable of empires. And across every sector, from occupied territories to council chambers, the story of humans' rise under Carter's command spread like wildfire, instilling both caution and respect, and setting the stage for the final phase of the campaign, where decisive blows would cement humanity's dominance, redefine interstellar power dynamics, and leave the Imperium grappling with the consequences of underestimating a species that had always been far more capable, resourceful, and resilient than any delegate, admiral, or emperor had imagined. And as preparations for the concluding operations continued, the full scope of Carter's vision became evident. Not merely to survive, not merely to defend, but to transform an underestimated species into a galactic force whose influence, ingenuity, and audacity would be remembered for generations, and whose rise would serve as a permanent reminder that the cosmos is never ruled solely by those who assume their dominance, but by those who combine courage, strategy, and foresight to seize opportunity when it is offered. The final phase of Admiral Carter's campaign unfolded with precision and audacity that left the Imperium and the galaxy itself in awe, as human fleets, meticulously coordinated across multiple sectors, struck simultaneously at the remaining critical nodes of alien command, supply, and communications, exploiting weaknesses that had been carefully cultivated over months of prior operations. And the alien admirals, now fractured, confused, and demoralized, found themselves unable to mount cohesive resistance, with each attempt to regroup met by preemptive strikes, ambushes, and feints that eroded both their confidence and their capacity to act effectively. And throughout this climactic period, human forces operated with seamless integration between reconnaissance, strike units, and logistical support, leveraging stealth technologies, adaptive tactics, and environmental manipulation to outmaneuver and outthink opponents who had assumed that numerical superiority, advanced weaponry, and centuries of established doctrine would guarantee their dominance. And as entire alien strongholds fell under carefully timed assaults, humanity demonstrated the full scope of its ingenuity and resolve, from orbital strikes and electronic disruption to rapid insertion of specialized teams capable of neutralizing strategic assets, all while maintaining the cohesion and morale of their own forces through disciplined command, clear objectives, and shared purpose. And across occupied and contested systems, civilian populations, scientists, engineers, and military personnel contributed to a seamless network of support, intelligence, and reinforcement, ensuring that every action reinforced the larger strategic vision and sustained the relentless pressure on the Imperium. And as the final major engagements unfolded, alien fleets, once confident and cohesive, now operated in a state of reactive desperation, their formations fragmented, supply lines disrupted, and commanders forced into choices that played directly into human strategy. And with every victory, Human forces not only secured territory and eliminated key targets, but also sent a resounding psychological message across the galaxy that the underestimated species of Earth had become a decisive, dominant force capable of dictating the outcome of conflicts on an unprecedented scale. And in the council chambers, where delegates had long derided humanity, discussions shifted to stunned recognition as reports detailed the complete transformation of human forces from dismissed observers to a species whose discipline, creativity, and tactical brilliance had shattered conventional assumptions and redefined the balance of power. And as Admiral Carter directed the final consolidation of victories, ensuring that captured systems were stabilized, alien remnants neutralized, and human control firmly established, the Imperium's remaining leadership faced the undeniable reality that centuries of dominance had been undone not by brute force alone, but by strategy, foresight, and the relentless determination of species that refuse to be underestimated. And across the galaxy, the legacy of these operations began to take root, as stories spread of humans who had turned apparent weakness into overwhelming advantage, exploited the predictability of ancient doctrines, and leveraged intelligence, adaptability, and courage to achieve the impossible. And as the last alien strongholds fell, communication networks collapsed, and surviving commanders surrendered or withdrew into isolation, the galaxy recognized that a single human admiral had changed history, not merely through military might, but through vision, discipline, and coordinated will of the species united in purpose. And in the aftermath, as systems were rebuilt, populations secured, and political structures recalibrated, the Imperium and all observing civilizations came to understand a profound lesson. Humanity, once mocked and dismissed, was a species whose ingenuity, resilience, and audacity could never be ignored, and that the underestimated, when guided by foresight, courage, and unyielding resolve, could reshape the course of galactic history, leaving a permanent mark on the cosmos, a testament to the power of determination, intelligence, and the extraordinary potential of one species to rise above expectation, alter the fate of countless worlds, and forever change the perception of what it meant to be human in a galaxy that had long assumed it was already ruled.